So it's 4:02, so I'm just going to start and share my screen. And hopefully you can see the opening slide. Yes. Yeah, if someone can give me a thumbs up in the chat, that'd be great. Great. Excellent. Okay. So I'm Dan, Dr. Dan Hurst. I'm an educational psychologist and a senior lecturer at Bristol Uni. I also founded and run EdSci, so edsci.org.uk, which I suppose we just describe as an online magazine now. And my Twitter is @EdSciDan. So feel free to tweet at me or, get in contact afterwards. Yeah, that would be great. Okay, so really excited to be part of this series, this sort of climate change, climate crisis series that EP Reach Out are doing. And I know there've been a couple of excellent talks in this series already. So thinking about Louise's talks around emotions and thinking about how we might support schools. Aoife has done a talk around nature and children's contact with nature. And I think there are a couple more talks to come as well. So it's great to be part of kind of this increasing interest in this area for educational psychologists. So before we start, I just wanted to give you a couple of moments to just think about this question. How do you feel about the climate crisis? And I'm just going to be quiet for 45, 50 seconds. And it'd be great if you could kind of use the chat if you want to. You don't have to, but use the chat to kind of put in some of your thoughts and reflections about this question. Okay. I'm getting quite a few responses. Helen, thanks, is scared and overwhelmed. Sarah and Nicole have worried and a bit powerless to make a difference. Sathia shares alarmed and at times hopeless. And Lucy shares anxious, angry, and powerless. Too big to conceptualize, Joanna. Yeah, overwhelming to think about. And Louise fearful, frustrated, and a little bit of shame. Yeah, these are really strong, powerful emotional feelings. And we're going to have a chance to come back to these later. And one of the messages that I hope that we'll consider and reflect on today is how really similar these emotional responses are that we have, how similar they are to the emotional responses that children and young people are having as well. So we will return to this notion of kind of thinking about the climate crisis as something that's facing us. I also wanted to share kind of like the guiding assumption for this presentation, and this comes from the discussion paper that I wrote for the DECP last year. It's in the summary of that discussion paper, but it really sums up the guiding assumption that underpins this whole presentation. It is not an understatement to suggest that perhaps the most severe and enduring macro-systemic influence on children's development now and into the future will be the state of the planet's climate, our vulnerability as a species to the effects of climate breakdown, and our ability to adapt or remain resilient to these changes. So that really hopefully frames kind of where I feel like I'm coming from, thinking about, it being the most severe and enduring macrosystemic influence on children's behavior or development, sorry. And, as EPs, lots of you will see in there a bit of a nod to Bronfenbrenner, thinking about his circles model and thinking about macrosystemic influences. So in this talk, I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about the impact of climate breakdown on children, children's views about climate change, supporting children and young people, but importantly here, really focusing on us as professionals, as people, as practitioners, and then also a little bit of time about how we might think about we reduce our carbon footprint. So this talk isn't about how to help children to cope, and it also isn't about having an assumption that EP service delivery is going to continue through a business as normal approach. I think that we have a role in, yes, supporting children and young people and communities and families, but we also have an absolute role in reducing our professional carbon footprint. There's layers to the IPCC, what they talk about. So there's adaptation and resilience, which might be about supporting children and communities and using our psychological skills. But there's also a real push to have to mitigate carbon emissions. And that's something that I think is important for us as a profession to focus on. I think there is something like over 4,000 EPs registered with the HCPC. That's a big professional group that can have a big change in terms of carbon emissions. So that's kind of where I hope we'll go in this talk. So, okay, so let's think about the impact of climate breakdown on children. So I want to start off with what UNICEF said in 2015. So firstly, children will bear the brunt of climate change, and climate change will make existing inequalities worse. I think that first point for us is just really indicative of how important and central the role of educational psychology is in thinking about the impacts of climate change with children, young people, families, and communities. Children will bear the brunt of climate change. And that's kind of borne out around the world, really, whether it be here at home or in other countries abroad. There is a lot of research looking at the effect of various changes to the climate around the world. And Clayton, Manning, and Hodge kind of pulled together with really, I think, a really lovely table to kind of help us conceptualize the impacts that climate change or climate degradation might have on physical and psychological health. So they've kind of here split it out through physical impacts and psychological impacts, and also thought about the effects of disasters, so things that might be more immediate, more immediate temporally, and then the effects of gradual climate impacts, so those things that might happen over a more extended period of time. So physically, they kind of highlight that the physical effects of disasters might be things like physical trauma, injury, death, disease, and the various after effects of a disaster, like difficulty accessing care. The physical effects then, that's then related to sort of psychological effects of disasters, so trauma and shock, anxiety, depression, grief, post-traumatic stress, strains on social relationships. And you can see how those kind of fit together. Clayton, Manning, and Hodge also then kind of pull that distinction out when we think about the effects of gradual climate impacts. Although for many people around the world, climate impacts are not gradual, they are happening now. And I think we could say the same about here at home in the UK. So the physical effects of gradual climate impacts might be health-related illness and death, disease and allergies, fetal developmental issues and general fitness. And the psychological effects of gradual impacts might be anxiety and depression, sense of loss, eco-grief, helplessness, fatalism, and a loss of autonomy and sense of control, which I think is really interesting when we reflect on what we said right at the beginning, where people talked about the climate crisis feeling too big to conceptualize, feeling powerless, not having autonomy, feeling a little bit of shame or powerless to make a difference. So already those kind of hypothesized psychological effects of gradual impacts are reflected in what Clayton, Manning, and Hodge were talking about in 2014 when we were thinking broadly. I think it's also really important to point out that it's not just direct climate impacts that will affect children and young people. There's an impact of awareness. So what I mean by that is there's an impact, children knowing that something's going on and that the climate is becoming more unstable, and that's having detrimental effects on communities and lives and countries. That has an impact as well. So in a scoping review for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, there was clear evidence to indicate that children and young people experience fear, sadness, anger, apocalyptic and pessimistic feelings, grief, anxiety, hopelessness, and powerlessness, all related to their awareness of the realities of global climate change and environmental destruction. Again, I think emotions that probably now feel familiar, we've thought about it right at the start of this talk, but it's there are these impacts of climate degradation and extreme, worsening weather events. There are these impacts directly, but there's also the impact of knowing that these things are going on. And I think we can kind of explore that a little bit more when we think, well, where do children sit in our societies? And one of the big things that's come from various research projects is that children and young people feel very passionately about this. And I think it's fair to say that they've kind of led the way in raising awareness about climate change around the world. But the experience of being ignored is kind of making things worse for them, making the experiences they already have around fear or sadness or anger, the being ignored is kind of heightening those feelings. There's a couple of pieces of research we can draw on here. So Caroline Hickman at the University of Bath carried out a piece of research in 2021 with a team, I think asking around 10,000 young people about their views around climate change. And one of the conclusions that was in that study is that negative thoughts, worry about climate change and impact on functioning, so daily functioning, were all positively correlated and showed substantial correlations with feelings of betrayal and negative beliefs about government response. The same year, the Children's Commissioner published The Big Answer, which was a response to the Big Ask. So a survey of UK school children about what was important to them for, fulfilling that function as the Children's Commissioner. I think there were 500,000 responses from children and young people to the Big Ask. And in The Big Answer, the Children's Commission, the final report, said that no matter where they were from, children in England were distressed when their voices were invalidated. They care about being heard. Those of you that followed sort of the recent COP conference, you might have known that there was, for the first time, a kind of a youth pavilion within the main area of the climate change COP conference, where children and young people could have the potential to interact with policymakers, ministers. But sometime into the conference, there were a couple of young people involved who were kind of highlighting that, the people who are making the decisions are not coming to talk to us. We've spoken to loads of people. I wrote a blog about this for the BPS a while ago about how children being ignored in that setting was kind of exacerbating some of the experiences they were reporting. So I think we have to be aware of sort of the direct impacts of climate change, the indirect impacts, the psychological impacts of being aware that something's happening, and then the added impacts of children feeling that they're ignored. We know that ourselves, don't we? If we feel strongly about something and we want to raise that with those in positions of influence or power, and we just feel ignored, that just makes us, certainly makes me, I'll own it, certainly makes me feel worse if that's the case. If we're thinking about the impacts of climate breakdown on children, I think one of the key things we have to consider as educational psychologists is that climate change does not affect all children equally, as we know across many other topic areas. So disadvantaged groups are more susceptible to the impact of climate change. And the framework that's been proposed to understand this was proposed by Islam and Winkle in 2017, who suggested that disadvantaged groups are generally more exposed to climate hazards. They're more susceptible to damage when they're exposed to those climate hazards. And they also have a reduced ability to cope with the impacts of that damage, which thus leaves them more exposed to climate hazards. So there's this kind of cycle that reinforces itself. And this is kind of exemplified here, where the relationship between disadvantage and inequality and the effects of climate-related events are not unidirectional. It's not linear. In fact, it's proposed to be sort of quite cyclical and self-reinforcing. So if you are more disadvantaged or experience greater inequality, it's likely that you're going to experience more severe effects of climate-related events, which leave you being more disadvantaged. So this sort of bi-directional relationship, disadvantage and inequality, leads to more severe effects. But the more severe effects of climate and climate breakdown lead to greater disadvantage and inequality. So I think we have to bear that in mind when we're thinking about the children and young people that we might be working with and supporting when we move forward. And I kind of want to show what this looks like in action. So thinking about this inequality in action, I'm going to draw on the idea of urban heat and green space. Now, I know Aoife in her previous talk has talked about connection with nature of children and young people, and I don't want to veer too much into that. So we're going to specifically think about urban heat and how this is a good example of inequality in action. So there is an increasing incidence of extreme heat waves, and the Met Office graphic here shows us that the top 10 warmest years in the UK all occurred since 2002. This is really important if we consider that 85% of the UK population live in urban areas, and this number is predicted to increase. So urbanisation is happening in the UK as well. Kumar then in 2021 analyzes lots of the data around heat and living in cities, and finds that the effects of rising global temperatures are more pronounced in cities. And there are reasons for that. So we think about the urban heat island effect, or I think it's something, aerosol radiative forcing, the idea of what aerosols in the air or particulates in the air do to the air of cities. This is important if we think about the top 10 years, the top 10 hottest years being since 2002, 85% of people living in cities, and the effects of global temperature rises being more pronounced in cities. This is important when we think about the effect of heat on us, on people. So increased stress, increased aggression, conflict, physical and psychological fatigue, sleep disturbance, mood, anxiety. I know there's research that looks at the complexity of the pattern around heat with aggression, for example. That's some of the research that looks broadly at what does heat do to people? What does heat do to us? We've got these ideas that it increases sleep disturbances, anxiety, stress, and physical and psychological discomfort or fatigue. What we also know, though, is that canopy cover can cool local air temperatures. That kind of transpiration effect, I think it's transpiration, sort of GCSE biology, that can cool local air temperatures, which is really important within an urban setting. But the spread of green spaces is not equal across urban areas, and city communities with higher proportions of poor residents or those from Asian, Black, and minority ethnic backgrounds have significantly less access to green spaces than those communities that are predominantly white or more affluent. And we start to see a complex picture here building up where we can see that actually it's pretty obvious that the climate effects are not going to be affecting every group of people in the same way. And I want to give you an example of the city I live, Bristol, where we can just use Google Maps to see the stark difference that this offers. So this is Clifton and Stoke Bishop, probably the most affluent part of the city. There's a lot of green here. There is a lot of tree canopy cover acting to cool the air in a city environment. If we go about 2 miles to the east, we've got Easton and Lawrence Hill, much higher density of housing, far fewer green spaces, far fewer trees. I mean, there are some, which is great, but if we compare the two, it's not really a comparison. This is in the same city, 2 miles apart, and we can start to kind of think about the children and young people that are growing up in these different environments are experiencing perhaps very different climate-related effects to their lives and communities. And I want to bring us back to this diagram. So the idea that disadvantage and inequality leads to more severe effects of climate-related events, like the experience of heat within an urban setting, which leads to more disadvantage and inequality. So if we take our example of Clifton and Stoke Bishop versus Easton and Lawrence Hill, those communities in Easton and Lawrence Hill have a lack of public green space, reduced access to private gardens, a lower tree canopy density. The locality is hotter, significantly higher population density, generally less money, and much reduced access to private and public transport. And I think this really exemplifies how climate change and the related events, like an increasing incidence of heat waves, doesn't affect children equally. And we might be working with children, particularly given the high percentage of the population that live in urban areas, that are experiencing very different having very different climate-related experiences. So, children's views about climate change. I kind of decided not to spend a lot of time on this bit because there's a pretty strong consensus. Children have high levels of concern. UNICEF have done this. I think a piece of research last year, or perhaps the end of 2021, showed that 9 out of 10 children and young people are worried about the climate in the future. Save the Children have done some research about this. The Children's Commissioners and many research papers have highlighted that children have significant concerns about our changing climate. And I just want to bring you back to that piece of research that I talked about earlier, the big answer from the Children's Commissioner, where they found that, as you might expect across all groups, children want to care for the world they are growing up in, to conserve it and protect it. When children were asked what they were most worried about, the environment was an overwhelming priority. They spoke of concern for animals and the impact of waste created by humans on habitats around the world. Very simply, many felt the same as this 12-year-old. If we don't fix climate change, we won't have a future. That was kind of, for me, that kind of just sums up, really well sums up all of the research around what children think. And we see what children think because they tell us frequently. In the paper that I wrote for the DCP, one of the things that I looked at was what have governmental and public responses been to children. And it's a really fascinating kind of exploration of how children's voices are delegitimized in a variety of ways, from the top of government right down to kind of like local media. So there's some commentary on that around, how various actors delegitimize children's voices, and some pushback from all the children's commissioners in the UK at the time who recognized that children's right to be heard in a range of jurisdictions was being denied, which might speak to our role as educational psychologists if we inhabit that kind of space of being an advocate for children and young people. So I want to move on now to kind of thinking about supporting children and young people. Bowden and Yakins, I think that's how you say it. Sorry if you're listening sometime in the future. Looked at This was specifically a piece of research that looked about how to support people who might be experiencing something called eco-anxiety. And that's something that I've been asked about a lot. How do we help children with eco-anxiety? And they looked at, I think, 36 pieces of research to try to pull out themes of, well, what's kind of like the way to support children. So I'm kind of people, so I'm extrapolating this to kind of think about children and young people generally. And they found kind of 5 themes in the research. So practitioners' inner work and education, fostering clients' inner resilience, encouraging clients to take action, helping clients find social connections and support, and connecting clients with nature. I think in my discussions with EPs, there's often a temptation to just look outwards and to just think about what we can do to foster a child's resilience or help them cope or manage with eco-anxiety, and to encourage them to take action. That might be in their local community, that might be being involved in school strikes or writing to MPs. Alongside that, though, I think we have to be aware of the risks of some of this approach. So the Australian Psychological Society have kind of highlighted the risk of an overburden of action on children and young people, and how that can lead to kind of detrimental emotional experiences as well. I've met young people who have certainly kind of inhabited that space of, it's up to me. If I don't do X, Y, Z, climate change will just get worse. And so there's this over-reliance on individual action. I think that's quite political as well, making us think that it's us individually. That's not me denying that individual action isn't worthwhile, but I think there are big systemic issues that it's quite probably politically useful to make individuals think that it's all up to them. But I think we as EPs, I think we kind of think, well, what's our role? We know how to do emotions, we know how to advocate for children, we're quite good at like sort of planning with children, and so we should focus on helping children have develop this inner resilience and to take action. But I want us to focus on this. I think practitioner inner work and education underpins all the rest of what Bowden and Yakins talk about. And I think it's something that hasn't really had a lot of attention within our professional development, our training courses, our continuing development, or our sort of professional narratives at all. So when I talk about practitioner inner work and education, these are the sorts of things that I just invite you to consider for a moment. I'll read them out as well, just in terms of for accessibility. To what extent do you understand and accept the climate crisis? Where and how are you being educated about the climate? What reactions and emotions does the topic evoke for you? Have you been able to explore and understand your own relationship with these complex thoughts and feelings? What is your relationship with the living planet? How can you expand your cultural competence to bring into focus cultural identity, connection with cultural tradition, ancestors, or land? Do you understand various models of grief and how these might apply to climate-related work? These are the sorts of things that I think we as a profession and as individual practitioners need to kind of be focusing on in the first instance. It's not that we can't have, I think, really positive effects when we work with children and young people in school communities to think about, we have a lot of young people who are worried about the climate and the future. We need some help. I think we can obviously do excellent work there. But I think what I'm advocating for is that this work, all of this work that Bowden and Yakins sort of identify as themes to support children who might be experiencing climate-related distress is underpinned by this idea of us spending time on our inner work and education. And so what might that look like? I've got some examples here. So a couple of examples about sort of developing that inner understanding from the Climate Psychology Alliance here. So I'm not a member of the Climate Psychology Alliance, but I have been to a few of their things. So these are all workshops that are available online. So Living with the Climate Crisis, an introductory workshop. Through the Door, which is a workshop for practitioners in understanding the climate crisis and various responses to it, or attending a climate cafe. I know Louise is here, and it's something that we recently talked about in an EP interest group around climate change, sort of climate cafes. And that's a non-action based space where people can talk about the thoughts and feelings that can often be quite taboo to talk about in other situations. So some of the emotions you raised earlier, anger, shame, fear, it's kind of hard to have these conversations sometimes. And if we're thinking about learning and education, the UN Climate Change Learning Partnership has a whole load of free online learning modules to go through that can help us develop our understanding and education around climate change. So these are just three webinars from the UNCC Learning Partnership. So climate change, from learning to action, climate change and human rights, and children and climate change. So these are the things that I think, if we can spend time looking at this sort of foundational step here, I think it enhances and cultivates a better course of action when we think about step 2, 3, 4, and 5, and how we might help clients find social connection or support, or encourage clients to take action, because we will have addressed some of these questions, which help us then inform the practice that we move forward with, whether that be with teachers or parents or young people. The last section that I just want to talk about is reducing our carbon footprint as a profession. I think we have to do that. The reason I say that is that the IPCC report in 2022 said that all global modeled pathways that limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius with no or limited overshoot, those that limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius, involve rapid and deep, and in most cases, immediate greenhouse gas emission reductions in all sectors. We are not exempt from that. I know it can feel really hard, and there's been so little work that's been done on this. I think it's sometimes even hard to conceptualize what could we do as a profession that could limit greenhouse gas emissions within our own work and within our own services. So I appreciate that, the whole point of raising this is that there isn't very little work done on this within the EP profession. But there are, as I say, I think over 4,000 ed sites registered with the HCPC. That is a big community that can take action. So again, recently, well, I'd say maybe last year, not recently, maybe the beginning of last year, I did try to have a think about what could the EP profession do to reduce carbon emissions. And these are some of the things that kind of, when I looked at sort of how we work and thought about that, and in conversation with colleagues, what could we do? I think firstly, measure carbon emissions and set targets. That's step number one. Unless we measure the carbon emissions that are coming from our practice and our service work, and set targets to reduce them, we can't go any further. I think we could increase EPs working on patch, and I know many services around the country do offer I suppose, incentives. I'm just going to call them an incentive to kind of move to that service. That might be a relocation incentive or something. And I think that kind of broadly fits into this idea of increasing EPs working on patch and thereby reducing travel. We are a highly mobile profession. Many of us use cars frequently to move from school to school to school. And actually, if we increase the number of EPs working on patch, the necessity for cars reduces. Now, I'm also not blind to the tragic state of public transport within rural areas in the country. I think we could explicitly organise EP school patches to minimise travel. We can make off-peak travel the organisational norm. And maybe that's about thinking about how we integrate climate considerations and some of these expectations within our service level agreements. So do we say to schools, for example, that no EP appointments would happen? Very rarely would EP appointments happen before 9:45. Why do I pick that time? Let's say we come out of rush hour, just so that driving is more efficient. We're spending shorter periods of time on the road, less stop and start, and we're able to be in our cars for shorter periods of time. Can LAs and services offer free travel alternatives? Does that include free train travel, free bus travel, free bicycles? I know many EPs in Bristol, it's a relatively compact city, who cycle to work already, but there are cycle to work schemes, but ultimately you end up paying for that. And I suppose I'm not advocating here for kind of a loan or some sort of repayment scheme. I'm thinking about how LAs and how services can offer free travel alternatives, and how can we incentivize EPs for public transport use? This is much more applicable, I appreciate, in bigger cities. Maybe that means thinking about the stuff that we need to carry with us. I appreciate it's going to be pretty hard to get on the bus when you're carrying a big psychometric with us. Are these considerations connected to how we think about the psychology we deliver as well? Scaling up remote working, I think that's happened kind of naturally as a byproduct, hasn't it, from COVID? But I think there's much more we can do there about proper investment, so that we're not running through 2 or 3 laptops every 2 years because they're such poor quality. Are we able to increase nature-based work? Can we take consultations outside? Can we do outside work based with children and young people? How do we utilize and how do we use sort of local nature resources, knowing sort of the positive effects that those places have, with reference to Aoife's YouTube talk a couple of weeks ago? And I think most importantly, it's something that we do at EdSci, is consider the climate in every organizational decision. And I know that sounds a bit OTT, but that is exactly what we do. In every decision we take as a small organization, we consider the climate impact that might have. Now that's from whether we buy a pad of paper through to where we meet and how we get there. And I think actually, if we make that an organizational norm, if we're making organizational decisions, whose role is it to raise the potential climate impact that decision might have. Is anyone doing that? Is anyone in the service, in the senior leadership team, raising that within organizational decision meetings about the various impacts it might have on carbon, on time, on procurement, for example? I think it's just, these are just all ideas that, as I say, there's very little work done on this. So, I'm kind of just picking things out for us to discuss and consider. But I think, if we started some of these, we'd be a lot further along than where we are as a profession now. And that's just kind of an encouragement to just kind of, again, a couple of minutes. And I'd be really interested in the chat again. How is your service reducing carbon emissions? If no, that's just say that. That's fine. I won't say your name because maybe colleagues are watching, but I'd just be really interested to kind of see how your services are reducing carbon emissions. So yeah, let me know in the chat. I'll keep an eye on it. It's for the next sort of 30-40 seconds. Okay, so online meetings when possible. I suppose that reduces the necessity to all drive to a central location. If that's kind of a COVID effect, that people now have the technology, or local authorities or services have the technology to make this happen. Okay. So in summary, this is my summary. Climate breakdown is an issue that's entirely relevant to professional EP practice. And I think with reference to that first table we saw, sort of thinking about the physical and psychological impacts of gradual climate change or disasters, we can see why that's relevant. What we haven't talked about today is the mass migration that's going to happen because of climate breakdown around the world. EPs have worked with refugees and asylum-seeking children for years. And I think, we have to think about our role in increased sort of global migration patterns as well, or eco-migrants or eco-refugees. So there's lots of different terminology used. Climate breakdown is having a range of effects on children and young people around the world, abroad and at home. And these effects are both immediate and gradual, physical and psychological. And there's a risk, I think, as we talked about at the beginning, that these issues feel overwhelming, but discussion must lead to direct and impactful action. And that's the last question I want to ask today. And yeah, I would really like to hear your answer to this question in the chat. So what one action will you take away from today? And make it as specific and descriptive as possible. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, give you some time to think about that action that you're going to take away. Also, I think now ask if there are any questions or comments or reflections. It'd be really great to hear those. I think in the chat or the Q&A. Right, so there's this idea of sort of thinking about small things to reduce carbon. And I think that's certainly where we started at EdSci. This, what are the little daily things we can do? Like, where do we book our meetings, or do we need to buy that pack of paper? It's all that sort of stuff. Another comment here: we're planning a new service delivery model for next year at the moment. So I'll bring these questions explicitly to discussions with colleagues in the senior team. That's fantastic. I mean, I'm assuming that there are those questions around sort of inner work and education that we're sort of thinking about, and also, what are we doing as a service to reduce our actual carbon emissions, as well as thinking about resilience and adaptation. Thanks, Amelia. So adding climate considerations to EBSA training, so emotionally based school avoidance or school non-attendance training for schools and services. I wonder what you mean by that. I mean, I wonder if you can say a little bit more just to kind of contextualize that. Yeah, I mean, Sarah and Nicole, this idea of keep presenting and sharing EP Reach Out webinars to raise awareness. Absolutely, one of the most important things we can do is talk about this issue with our friends, our family. You think about where they're coming from, what their view is. There was some really interesting research from, I think it's the Yale Center of Climate Communications, that's asking people to move away from this idea of climate, um, climate acceptors and climate deniers, but to think about people on a spectrum. So I think there's, alarmed, cautious, um, doubtful. There's all these sorts of more of a spectrum approach, and very few people are actually dismissive. Very few people are actually dismissive of the idea that climate change and negative effects are being experienced. So it's kind of thinking about where people are on their journey. Thanks, Satya. So taking this with you to the team so that we can reflect on our role as EPs and our service as a whole. Yeah, having that discussion, just opening it up. It might be the first time that the service has ever talked about this thing. Yeah, okay. So thanks, Amelia. Thinking about that, bringing this to kind of some of that EBSA training around, climate anxiety is an additional anxiety barrier. And that it sounds like that's come up from discussions with young people. And that doesn't really surprise me when we think about the research from the Children's Commissioner or Caroline Hickman's research. Very like frequently that the environment, the future, the planet, and the climate are things that young people are thinking about. Any other questions or reflections before we finish? I'm just going to flash up the last slide again so that you can see my email and uh, Twitter handle. So if you do want anything or want to further this conversation or ask anything, just let me know at either of those. I'm more than happy to hear from you and have those conversations. Yeah, I think that's it. So thank you very much for listening. And yeah, it's been a pleasure to talk to you about it. Thanks. Thanks, Mania. Thank you. Thanks, Leah. Thanks, Lucy. Good to see you. You know what I mean. Thanks, Joanna.